We're about 25 miles north of New York City, in the Westchester County town of Hawthorne, at Gate of Heaven Cemetery. It's a sprawling Catholic burial ground, established in 1917, and home to more than 200,000 souls. But one draws more visitors than all the rest combined. Follow the winding road up into Section 25, and you'll know you found it before you even read the name. There are baseballs everywhere. Baseballs, bats, caps, flags, ribbons from youth tournaments, and the occasional truly strange offering. A cemetery worker once told a reporter that a man in a cook's apron pulled up one day, walked a pizza box up the hill, set it on the grave, opened the lid, and drove away without a word. You'd have to think the babe would have appreciated that. George Herman Ruth was born in Baltimore in 1895, and by the age of 7 his behavior was so unruly that his parents signed his custody over to the Zavarian brothers at St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys. It was there that a young Ruth first picked up a baseball. The rest, as they say, is history, though what a history it was. He broke into the majors as a pitcher with the Boston Red Sox, and a talented one at that, but it was his bat that would change the game forever. After Boston sold him to the New York Yankees in 1920, a transaction that would haunt Red Sox fans for 86 years, Ruth proceeded to rewrite the record books. His 60 home runs in 1927 stood as the single-season record for 34 years. He was a charter inductee into the Baseball Hall of Fame, and he became something more than an athlete. He became an American folk hero, larger than life in every sense of the phrase. Ruth was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1946. He was actually among the first cancer patients to receive a combined regimen of radiation and chemotherapy, though the treatments could not save him. He died in his sleep on August 16, 1948, at the age of 53. His body lay in state at Yankee Stadium for 2 days, and it's estimated that 100,000 people filed past his casket. His funeral mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral drew tens of thousands more, and an estimated 100,000 people lined the 30-mile route from Manhattan to this cemetery. More than 75 years later, the path to his grave still never grows over with snow. There are always fresh footprints. Just a few miles south of here in Valhalla, New York, lies Kensico Cemetery, a beautifully landscaped property in the shadow of the Kensico Dam. And it's here that we find the teammate whose name will forever be linked to Ruth's. Lou Gehrig played first base for the New York Yankees for 17 seasons, appearing in 2,130 consecutive games, a streak of endurance so remarkable it earned him the nickname the Iron Horse. That record stood for 56 years until Cal Ripken Jr. broke it in 1995. Gehrig's numbers were staggering. A lifetime batting average of .340, 493 home runs, and 1,995 runs batted in. He was the backbone of the legendary 1927 Yankees, batting cleanup behind Ruth in what many still call the greatest lineup ever assembled, but it's how Gehrig's career ended that most people remember. In the spring of 1939, his play began to decline in ways that baffled everyone. He was stumbling, losing strength, unable to hit with his usual power. On May 2nd, he voluntarily benched himself, ending the consecutive game streak. Weeks later, doctors at the Mayo Clinic delivered the devastating diagnosis: amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a degenerative disease with no cure. On July 4, 1939, Gehrig stood before a packed Yankee Stadium and delivered what many consider the greatest speech in sports history. "Today," he told the crowd, "I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth." He was 36 years old. Less than 2 years later, on June 2, 1941, he was gone. The disease would come to bear his name, Lou Gehrig's disease, and his farewell address remains one of the most quoted moments in American life. He rests here at Kensico with his wife Eleanor, who never remarried and devoted the rest of her life to ALS research. From the hills of Westchester, let's head south across the George Washington Bridge and down the Jersey Shore to Middletown, New Jersey. Mount Olivet Cemetery is a modest Catholic burial ground on Chapel Hill Road, and it draws a very particular kind of pilgrim. football fans. They come because of a man who, in life, probably would have been surprised to find himself buried in Middletown at all. But Vince Lombardi lived in nearby Fairhaven when he was an assistant coach with the New York Giants in the 1950s, and his family put down roots here. So when the most famous football coach in American history was laid to rest, this is where he came. Before Lombardi became a legend, he was a devout Catholic kid from Brooklyn who played on Fordham University's offensive line, part of a unit nicknamed the 7 Blocks of Granite. After college, he spent time in seminary studying for the priesthood before deciding his calling was the gridiron. He coached high school football in New Jersey, earning the bulk of his salary teaching Latin. He worked as an assistant at Fordham and then at West Point before joining the Giants' coaching staff, where a young fellow assistant named Tom Landry, whom we'll visit later in Texas, was handling the defense. In 1959, at the age of 45, Lombardi accepted the head coaching job with the Green Bay Packers, a franchise that had won only 1 game the previous season. Within 2 years, Green Bay was playing for the NFL championship. Over the next decade, Lombardi's Packers won 5 NFL titles, including victories in the first 2 Super Bowls. His teams were built on discipline, preparation, and a ferocious will to win. "Winning isn't everything," he famously said. "It's the only thing." In 1969, Lombardi left Green Bay to coach the Washington Redskins, but his tenure lasted only 1 season. He was diagnosed with colon cancer and died on September 3, 1970, at the age of 57. His funeral at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York was the largest held there since Robert Kennedy's 2 years earlier. The Super Bowl trophy was renamed in his honor the following year, and every winter the winning team hoists the Vince Lombardi Trophy, a name that means excellence. Visitors to his grave here in Middletown often leave signed footballs, team jerseys, and if they're Packers fans, those famous foam cheeseheads. Let's head back into New York City now, to Brooklyn, specifically, and Cypress Hills Cemetery. Founded in 1848, this 225-acre burial ground straddles the Brooklyn-Queens border, and it's bisected by a parkway that was renamed in 1997 in honor of the very man we've come to see. Jackie Robinson changed America. There's really no simpler way to say it. When he stepped onto the field at Ebbets Field on April 15, 1947, as a member of the Brooklyn Dodgers, he became the first African American to play in Major League Baseball in the modern era, breaking a color barrier that had stood for more than 60 years. Robinson had been handpicked by Dodgers general manager Branch Rickey, who told him he needed a player with the courage not to fight back. And Robinson had that courage in abundance. He endured death threats, racial slurs from opponents and fans, and teammates who initially refused to play alongside him. He answered all of it with his bat, his glove, and his blazing speed on the base paths. Robinson was no ordinary ball player even apart from the history he made. He was Rookie of the Year in 1947, the National League's most valuable player in 1949, a 6-time All-Star, and a key member of the Dodger teams that won 6 pennants and the 1955 World Series. Before baseball, he'd been the first athlete in UCLA history to letter in 4 sports: baseball, basketball, football, and track. After retiring from the game in 1956, Robinson became a vocal advocate for civil rights and a successful businessman. Robinson was only 53 when he died of a heart attack at his home in Stamford, Connecticut, on October 24, 1972. Diabetes and heart disease had aged him far beyond his years. In 1997, 25 years after his passing, Major League Baseball retired his number 42 across every team in the league, the only player ever so honored across the entire sport. His grave here at Cypress Hills sits on a hill, and fans regularly leave baseballs and bats at the foot of his headstone. Our next stop requires a detour to one of the more unusual burial stories in American sports. We're heading to the town of Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, a small borough in the Pocono Mountains that was originally called Mauch Chunk. The town changed its name in 1954, and the reason involves one of the greatest athletes who ever lived. Jim Thorpe was born in 1887 in a one-room cabin in what was then Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. A member of the Sac and Fox Nation, Thorpe rose to fame at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, where Coach Pop Warner turned him into one of the most versatile athletes the world had ever seen. At the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm, Thorpe won gold medals in both the pentathlon and the decathlon, the only person ever to win both in the same games. King Gustav V of Sweden reportedly told him, "You, sir, are the greatest athlete in the world." Thorpe's reply, according to legend, was simply, "Thanks, King." But Thorpe's Olympic glory was stripped from him in 1913 when it was discovered he had been paid small amounts to play minor league baseball, a common practice at the time, but technically a violation of the amateur rules. His medals weren't restored until 1983, 30 years after his death. Beyond the Olympics, Thorpe played professional football and Major League Baseball, and served as the first president of what became the NFL. Thorpe died of heart failure in 1953 at the age of 65, in his trailer home in Lomita, California. His third wife, Patricia, had planned a funeral in Oklahoma, but when the state legislature wouldn't fund a memorial, she struck a deal with the boroughs of Mauch Chunk and East Mauch Chunk in Pennsylvania. If they merged and renamed themselves Jim Thorpe, she would allow his body to be interred there. The towns agreed. To this day, the town of Jim Thorpe is the final resting place of a man who never set foot there in his life. His descendants have periodically sought to have his remains returned to Oklahoma, but as of now, he rests here in this small Pocono mountain town that bears his name. From the mountains of Pennsylvania, let's travel west to South Bend, Indiana, home of the Fighting Irish and the most storied football program in college history. Highland Cemetery on Portage Avenue is where we find a man whose name is synonymous with Notre Dame. Knute Rockne coached the Fighting Irish from 1918 to 1930, compiling a record of 105 wins, 12 losses, and 5 ties. A winning percentage of .881, still the highest in the history of college football. His teams won 3 national championships, had 5 undefeated seasons, and produced the legendary four-horseman backfield of 1924. Rockne was also an innovator who popularized the forward pass and the shift formation, fundamentally changing the way football was played. Rockne was born in Norway in 1888 and emigrated to Chicago as a child. He played end at Notre Dame and was part of the team that stunned Army in 1913 with a passing attack that shocked the football establishment. After his playing days, he coached and also found time to work as a chemistry instructor. His halftime speeches became the stuff of legend. The most famous, Win One for the Gipper, invoked the memory of former player George Gipp, who had died young. Ronald Reagan would later play Gipp in the 1940 film Knute Rockne, All-American. On March 31, 1931, Rockne boarded a plane in Kansas City bound for Los Angeles, where he was headed to work on a film project. The Fokker trimotor aircraft encountered ice and structural failure over the Flint Hills of Kansas and crashed into a wheat field, killing all 8 on board. Rockne was 43. His funeral at Notre Dame drew national mourning on a scale rarely seen for a sports figure. When the Fighting Irish play at home, fans still gather around Rockne's grave here at Highland Cemetery to hear former players speak and to play the Notre Dame Victory March. From South Bend, we continue west to Chicago, where Oak Woods Cemetery on the city's south side holds the remains of one of the most significant athletes in American history. In the summer of 1936, a 22-year-old from Alabama named James Cleveland Owens, known to the world as Jesse, traveled to Berlin for the Olympic Games. Adolf Hitler had intended the Berlin Olympics as a showcase for his theories of Aryan supremacy. Jesse Owens had other plans. Over the course of those games, Owens won 4 gold medals in the 100 meters, the 200 meters, the long jump, and the 4x100-meter relay, becoming the most decorated athlete of the 1936 Olympics and demolishing Hitler's racial fantasies on the world stage. What many people don't know is that Owens had already delivered arguably the single greatest day in the history of track and field a year earlier. On May 25, 1935, at the Big Ten Championships in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Owens set 3 world records and tied a 4th, all in the span of about 45 minutes. He was competing with a back so sore he could barely bend down to touch the starting line. After the Olympics, Owens returned to an America that celebrated his athletic triumphs but still enforced segregation. He wasn't invited to the White House. He barnstormed to make a living, racing against horses and motorcycles for paying crowds. He eventually settled in Chicago, where he worked in public relations and as a motivational speaker. President Gerald Ford awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1976. Owens smoked a pack a day for 35 years, and lung cancer took his life in Tucson, Arizona on March 31, 1980. He was 66. His grave at Oak Woods sits among other pillars of Black American history. Journalist Ida B. Wells, Chicago's first black mayor Harold Washington, and physicist Enrico Fermi are all buried in the same cemetery. Not far from Oak Woods, on the north side of Chicago, is Graceland Cemetery, one of the finest Victorian-era cemeteries in the country, with elaborate mausoleums and towering monuments among ancient oaks. And here, in more modest surroundings, rests a man whose enthusiasm for baseball was so infectious it could light up an entire city. Ernie Banks played 19 seasons for the Chicago Cubs from 1953 to 1971, and in all that time he never once appeared in a postseason game. The Cubs were, to put it charitably, not very good during those years, and yet Banks played every day with a joy and energy that made him one of the most beloved figures in the history of the sport. "It's a beautiful day for a ball game," he would say. "Let's play two." That phrase became his trademark, and it captured something essential about the man. He simply loved being at the ballpark. Banks hit 512 home runs, a remarkable number for a shortstop, and won back-to-back National League Most Valuable Player awards in 1958 and 1959, the first National League player ever to win the award in consecutive seasons. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1977 and received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2013. The Cubs retired his number 14, and his statue stands outside Wrigley Field. Banks grew up in Dallas, Texas, the son of a semi-professional softball player. He served in the Army during the Korean War, and after his discharge, he played for the Kansas City Monarchs of the Negro Leagues before being signed by the Cubs. He was one of the first African-American players on the team. Banks died on January 23, 2015, at the age of 83, from a heart attack. Mr. Cub, as he's known in Chicago, rests here at Graceland among the city's industrial titans and cultural luminaries, a fitting place for a man who was, in his own way, as much a part of Chicago as the lakefront or the L. While we're in the Chicago area, let's pay a quieter kind of tribute. Walter Payton, the great running back known as Sweetness, is buried in a private location near his home in the northwest suburbs. Out of respect for the family's wishes, we won't name the precise location, but his legacy deserves a moment of our time. Payton played 13 seasons for the Chicago Bears from 1975 to 1987, and when he retired, he held the NFL's all-time rushing record with 16,726 yards, a mark that stood for 15 years until Emmitt Smith surpassed it. But the yardage only tells part of the story. Payton was the most complete running back the game had ever seen. He could run, catch, block, and even throw. He completed 11 passes in his career, including 8 for touchdowns. He played with a relentless, punishing style, lowering his shoulder into defenders rather than running out of bounds. He missed only one game in his entire career. Off the field, Payton was known for his generosity, his practical jokes, and his infectious personality. When he was diagnosed with a rare liver disease called primary sclerosing cholangitis and needed an organ transplant, he went public with his condition to raise awareness about organ donation. The transplant never came. Payton died on November 1, 1999, at the age of 45. His death was ultimately attributed to bile duct cancer. The outpouring of grief across Chicago and the NFL was immense. The NFL's Man of the Year award, given annually to the player who best combines on-field excellence with off-field community service, was renamed the Walter Payton Man of the Year Award in his honor. From Chicago, Let's head deep into the South, to Birmingham, Alabama, and Elmwood Cemetery. This is one of the grand historic cemeteries of the American South, dating to 1880, with winding lanes shaded by magnolias and moss-draped oaks. Among its permanent residents is a man who remains, decades after his death, the most revered figure in Alabama football history. Paul Bear Bryant coached college football for 38 years, but it's his 25 seasons at the University of Alabama, from 1958 to 1982, that made him a legend. Under Bryant, the Crimson Tide won 6 national championships and 13 Southeastern Conference titles. His career record of 323 wins was, at the time of his retirement, the most in Division I college football history. He was known for his houndstooth hat, his gravelly voice, and a toughness forged during a childhood of grinding poverty in rural Arkansas. The nickname Bear reportedly came from an incident in his youth when, on a dare, he wrestled a bear at a theater show. Bryant's coaching philosophy was built on discipline and conditioning. His training camps were notoriously brutal. The 1954 pre-camp session at Texas AANDM, held in the scorching heat of Junction, Texas, was so grueling that more than half the players quit. The survivors became known as the Junction Boys. But those who endured Bryant's methods became something more than football players. They became, by his reckoning, men who could handle anything life threw at them. Bryant retired after the 1982 season, having told friends he'd die within weeks if he stopped coaching. He was almost right. Just 28 days after coaching his final game, Paul Bear Bryant suffered a heart attack and died on January 26, 1983. He was 69 years old. His funeral procession in Birmingham stretched for miles, with mourners lining the route all the way to Elmwood Cemetery. In Alabama, there are people who can tell you exactly where they were when Bear Bryant died, the same way others remember where they were when Kennedy was shot. Let's stay in the South and head east to a small town in northeast Georgia. Royston is a quiet place, population around 3,000, and it might not be on your map if it weren't for one thing: Rose Hill Cemetery and the grave of Tyrus Raymond Cobb. Ty Cobb remains one of the most complex and controversial figures in all of sports. His lifetime batting average of .366 is the highest in Major League history, and almost certainly a record that will never be broken. He won 12 American League batting titles, including 9 in a row. He held the career hits record until Pete Rose passed him in 1985. He was the first player elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1936, receiving more votes than even Babe Ruth. On the field, Cobb was ferocious. He played with a barely controlled fury, sliding into bases with his spikes high, picking fights, antagonizing opponents and teammates alike. Off the field, Cobb was widely regarded as one of the most disagreeable men in professional sports. His reputation for racism, violence, and general misanthropy followed him throughout his life and beyond. But the full picture is more nuanced than the legend suggests. In his later years, Cobb donated significant sums to build a hospital in Royston and to fund educational scholarships for students in Georgia. The Cobb Memorial Hospital still serves the community today. Cobb played 24 seasons, mostly with the Detroit Tigers, and retired in 1928. He was wealthy from shrewd investments. He was an early buyer of Coca-Cola and General Motors stock, and spent his final years largely alone, estranged from most of his family and former teammates. He died of prostate cancer, diabetes, and Bright's disease on July 17, 1961, at the age of 74. Only 3 people from the baseball world attended his funeral. He rests here at Rose Hill Cemetery in the town where he grew up, far from the stadiums where he terrorized pitchers for a quarter century. Our next stop keeps us in Georgia but takes us to one of the most beautiful urban cemeteries in America. Oakland Cemetery in Atlanta, established in 1850, is a stunning 6-acre garden with Victorian-era monuments, rolling hills, and sweeping views of the downtown skyline. It's here that we find a man who brought a different kind of grace to the sporting world. Robert Tyre, Bobby Jones Jr., is widely considered the greatest amateur golfer who ever lived, and one of the greatest golfers, period. Between 1923 and 1930, Jones won 13 major championships, including 5 U.S. Amateurs, 4 U.S. Opens, 3 Open Championships, and 1 British Amateur. In 1930, he achieved something no one had done before or has done since. He won all 4 major tournaments in a single year, the Grand Slam. And then, at the age of 28, at the peak of his powers, he retired from competitive golf. He simply walked away. Jones never turned professional. He played golf because he loved it, and he saw no reason to make it a job. After retiring, he co-founded the Augusta National Golf Club and co-created the Masters Tournament, which held its first event in 1934 and remains one of the most prestigious events in all of sports. Jones was also a practicing attorney with degrees from Georgia Tech, Harvard, and Emory, a Renaissance man in an era when athletes were often dismissed as mere jocks. In 1948, Jones was diagnosed with syringomyelia, a painful degenerative condition of the spinal cord. Over the next 2 decades, he slowly lost the ability to walk, then to use his hands. He bore his decline with characteristic dignity, continuing to attend the Masters each year in a golf cart and then a wheelchair. Bobby Jones died on December 18, 1971, at the age of 69. He rests here at Oakland Cemetery alongside some of Atlanta's most distinguished citizens, including Margaret Mitchell, the author of Gone with the Wind. Staying right here in Atlanta, let's travel across town to Southview Cemetery, the oldest African-American cemetery in the city. Founded in 1886 by a group of formerly enslaved black businessmen, Southview has become the final resting place for many of Atlanta's most prominent African-American citizens, including Congressman John Lewis and civil rights leader Julian Bond. And since 2021, it has also been the resting place of one of baseball's true giants. Henry Louis Aaron, Hammer and Hank, hit 755 home runs over the course of a career that spanned from 1954 to 1976. For 33 years, that was the all-time record, surpassing the mark set by Babe Ruth, the man whose grave we visited at the start of our journey. Aaron broke Ruth's record on April 8, 1974, hitting number 715 off Al Downing of the Los Angeles Dodgers at Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. More than 50,000 fans celebrated as Aaron circled the bases. But the road to 715 was harrowing. As Aaron approached Ruth's record, he received an avalanche of hate mail and death threats from people who couldn't stomach the idea of a black man breaking the most cherished record in the white-dominated sport. Aaron needed a bodyguard and slept in separate hotels from his teammates for his own safety. He later said that the pursuit of the record was the most difficult experience of his life. And this from a man who had grown up in segregated Mobile, Alabama. Aaron was a 25-time All-Star, a 3-time Gold Glove winner, the 1957 National League Most Valuable Player, and a member of the World Series champion Milwaukee Braves that same year. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1982 with nearly 98% of the vote. After his playing career, Aaron remained in Atlanta as a Braves executive and a quiet but steady advocate for greater opportunities for minorities in baseball's front offices. He died peacefully in his sleep on January 22, 2021, at the age of 86. His funeral procession drove down Hank Aaron Drive to the site of the old stadium, pausing at the very spot where his 715th home run had landed. Then it continued on to Southview, where every member of the grounds crew helped dig his grave, so they could all one day tell their children they'd laid Hammer and Hank to rest. Let's travel now to the center of the country, to Kansas City, Missouri, and Forest Hill Cemetery. In a section called the Satchel Paige Memorial Garden, we find one of the most colorful characters the game of baseball has ever known. Leroy Robert Satchel Paige may have been the greatest pitcher who ever lived, though we'll never know for certain, because he spent most of his career in the Negro Leagues, shut out of the major leagues by the color barrier. Paige barnstormed across America for over 2 decades, pitching for any team that would pay him, sometimes appearing in as many as 3 games in a single day in different cities. His fastball was legendary, and so were his stories. He claimed to have won over 2,000 games in his career, though exact records from the Negro Leagues are incomplete. In 1948, at the age of 42, an age when most players are long retired, Paige finally got his chance in the majors when Bill Veeck signed him to the Cleveland Indians. He became the oldest rookie in Major League history and helped the Indians win the World Series that year. He continued to pitch intermittently into his late 50s, making his final Major League appearance in 1965 at the age of 59, when he threw 3 scoreless innings for the Kansas City Athletics. Paige was famous for his wit and his folksy wisdom. His rules for staying young included gems like, avoid fried meats which angry up the blood, and don't look back. Something might be gaining on you. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1971 as the first player honored primarily for his Negro League career. Paige died of a heart attack on June 8, 1982, at the age of 75. He rests here at Forest Hill, not far from another baseball legend, Zach Wheat, in a cemetery where the graves of the game's greatest span the decades. From Kansas City, let's fly southwest to Dallas, Texas and Hillcrest Memorial Park, a well-maintained cemetery in the northern part of the city. Here we find a man who was, for a generation of Americans, the very embodiment of baseball stardom. Mickey Charles Mantle played 18 seasons for the New York Yankees from 1951 to 1968. And during that span, he hit 536 home runs, won 3 American League Most Valuable Player awards, and led the Yankees to 12 pennants and 7 World Series titles. His combination of power from both sides of the plate and blazing speed made him perhaps the most naturally gifted player of his era. When he connected with a pitch, the ball seemed to leave the stadium on a different trajectory than anyone else's home runs. There's a reason the term tape measure home run was essentially invented for Mantle. What made Mantle's achievements even more remarkable was that he played most of his career on damaged knees. A high school football injury was compounded by a torn ligament suffered during the 1951 World Series, and from that point forward, Mantle's legs were heavily wrapped before every game. He played in constant pain, and many who saw him believed that a healthy Mantle would have shattered every record in the book. Off the field, Mantle struggled. He was a hard drinker throughout his career and beyond, and he later acknowledged that alcohol had robbed him of years he might have played and years he might have enjoyed with his family. In 1995, he received a liver transplant, but liver cancer was discovered shortly afterward. Mickey Mantle died on August 13, 1995, at the age of 63. In his final press conference, he looked into the camera and told the country, "Don't be like me." It was perhaps the most honest thing he ever said. Just a few miles from Hillcrest at Sparkman Hillcrest Memorial Park, we find the grave of a man whose name is inseparable from the Dallas Cowboys. Tom Landry coached the Cowboys for 29 consecutive seasons, from the team's founding in 1960 until he was dismissed in 1989. Under Landry, Dallas won 13 division titles, appeared in 5 Super Bowls, and won 2 of them. His innovations, the flex defense, the multiple offense, the shotgun formation, changed the way football was played and coached. And his image, the fedora hat, the stoic expression on the sideline, the arms folded across his chest, became one of the most recognizable in all of sports. Before he was a coach, Landry was a World War II veteran who flew 30 missions as a B-17 co-pilot over Europe. He survived a crash landing in occupied France and came home to play defensive back for the New York Yankees of the All-America Football Conference, and later, the New York Giants. It was with the Giants that he began his coaching career, working alongside another assistant we visited earlier, Vince Lombardi. Those 2 men working for the same team would go on to become the 2 most famous coaches in NFL history. Landry was 75 when he died of leukemia on February 12, 2000. He was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1990. His grave here at Sparkman Hillcrest is a popular stop for Cowboys fans, many of whom grew up watching the man they called Coach lead America's team. Let's drive west from Dallas to Fort Worth, about 30 miles, and Greenwood Memorial Park. In the mausoleum here rests a man whose golf swing is still studied and imitated by players around the world. William Ben Hogan is considered one of the greatest golfers in the history of the game. He won 64 PGA Tour events, including 9 major championships, a total that ties him for 4th all-time. He is one of only 5 players to have won all 4 of golf's modern major championships: the Masters, the US Open, the Open Championship, and the PGA Championship. But what sets Hogan apart from other golfers is the story behind the statistics. In February 1949, Hogan and his wife Valerie were driving through West Texas when a Greyhound bus, trying to pass a truck in heavy fog, slammed into their car head-on. Hogan threw himself across Valerie to protect her, a move that saved his life. The steering column was driven through the driver's seat where he'd been sitting. He suffered a double fracture of the pelvis, a broken collarbone, a broken ankle, a broken rib, and near-fatal blood clots. Doctors said he might never walk again, let alone play golf. 16 months later, Hogan won the 1950 US Open in a playoff, his legs wrapped in bandages. It remains one of the most astonishing comebacks in sports history. In 1953, he won 5 of the 6 tournaments he entered, including 3 consecutive majors, a feat known as the Hogan Slam. His book on golf technique became a bestseller, and his swing remains a kind of platonic ideal for the sport. Ben Hogan lived to be 84, dying on July 25, 1997. His comeback from that car wreck has inspired athletes in every sport for over 70 years. Before we leave the Dallas-Fort Worth area, let's stop back at Sparkman Hillcrest for a name that most American sports fans won't recognize, but tennis fans absolutely will. Maureen Connolly is buried here alongside her husband, Norman Brinker, who was himself a member of the U.S. Olympic equestrian team. Maureen Little Mo Connolly was a tennis prodigy from San Diego who became one of the most dominant players in the history of the women's game. In 1953, at just 18 years of age, she became the first woman to win all 4 Grand Slam tournaments in a single calendar year, a feat not matched until Margaret Court did it in 1970. She won 9 major singles titles in all, and during one stretch, she won 50 consecutive matches. Her game was built on relentless baseline power at a time when most women played a more genteel style. Then, in the summer of 1954, a horseback riding accident shattered her leg and ended her competitive career at the age of 19. She was never able to return to tournament play. After retiring, Connolly coached, married, and raised 2 daughters. She founded the Maureen Connolly Brinker Tennis Foundation to support junior players. Tragically, she developed stomach cancer and died on June 21, 1969, at just 34 years old. Her career was heartbreakingly brief, but in those few years, she was as dominant as any athlete in any sport has ever been. From Texas, let's head north to Ohio, a state rich in sports history. Our first stop is Sunset Hills Burial Park in Canton, the same city that's home to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But we're here for a baseball man. Thurman Munson was the heart and soul of the New York Yankees during their resurgence in the 1970s. As the team's starting catcher from 1969 to 1979, Munson was a 7-time All-Star, won 3 consecutive Gold Glove awards, was the American League's most valuable player in 1976, and helped lead the Yankees to back-to-back World Series titles in 1977 and 1978. He was named the first Yankee captain since Lou Gehrig. Munson was a fierce competitor with a gruff exterior but a deeply loyal heart. He and Reggie Jackson famously clashed in the Yankee clubhouse, but Munson's teammates universally respected him. He was also devoted to his family in Canton, Ohio, and purchased a private plane so he could fly home to see his wife Diana and their children on off days during the season. On August 2, 1979, Munson was practicing takeoffs and landings in his Cessna Citation jet at Akron-Canton Airport when the plane came up short of the runway. The impact severed his spinal cord, leaving him unable to escape the wreckage as it caught fire. He was 32 years old. The Yankees played a game the following night, and the team took the field with the catcher's position left empty. The crowd at Yankee Stadium stood and wept for 8 minutes. His number 15 was retired by the team, and he remains the only Yankee captain whose number has been retired without a Hall of Fame induction. About 60 miles north in Cleveland lies one of the great historic cemeteries of Ohio, Lakeview Cemetery, a sprawling Victorian-era burial ground with views of Lake Erie. Among its many notable residents, including President James Garfield, Eliot Ness, and industrialist John D. Rockefeller, is a man who holds one of the saddest distinctions in baseball history. Ray Chapman was a talented shortstop for the Cleveland Indians, known for his speed, his bunting ability, and his cheerful disposition. He was 29 years old and newly married in the summer of 1920 when, on August 16th, he stepped to the plate against the New York Yankees' Carl Mays. In an era before batting helmets, before umpires regularly replaced scuffed and dirty baseballs, Mays delivered a pitch that Chapman apparently never saw. The ball struck him in the left temple. Chapman collapsed and was rushed to a hospital, where he died the following morning. He remains the only major league player to die from being hit by a pitch during a game. Chapman's death shook baseball to its core and led directly to significant rule changes. Umpires began replacing dirty, discolored balls more frequently during games. The spitball, which made a pitched ball harder to see, was banned. And eventually, the tragedy contributed to the adoption of batting helmets, though those wouldn't become mandatory for decades. Chapman rests here at Lakeview, where he has been for more than a century. About 20 miles east of Cleveland, in the small community of Gates Mills, we find Gates Mills North Cemetery, a modest country graveyard that holds the remains of one of baseball's most remarkable stories. Bob Feller was just 17 years old when he took the mound for the Cleveland Indians in 1936, a farm boy from Van Meter, Iowa, whose fastball was so good that Major League scouts had been tracking him since he was a teenager. In his first Major League start, he struck out 15 batters. By the age of 20, he was the best pitcher in the American League, throwing multiple no-hitters and racking up strikeouts at a rate the game had never seen. Then came Pearl Harbor. 2 days after the Japanese attack, Feller walked into a Navy recruiting office and enlisted, becoming the first Major League player to volunteer for military service after December 7th. He spent nearly 4 years in the Navy, serving aboard the USS Alabama and earning 8 battle stars. He was 23 when he went to war, and 26 when he came back. Years that should have been the prime of his career, simply given away. And yet Feller returned and picked up right where he left off. He threw a no-hitter on opening day of 1946, his first game back from the war, and continued to dominate through the early 1950s. He won 266 games in his career, a total that would have been significantly higher had he not lost those 4 seasons to the war. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1962. Feller lived to the age of 92, dying on December 15, 2010, and he spent decades after retirement as a tireless ambassador for the game. He rests in this quiet cemetery near the community he called home. Staying in Ohio, let's drive down to the southeastern corner of the state, to the tiny hamlet of Paoli near Newcomerstown. Paoli Cemetery is about as far from the big leagues as you can get, a small rural graveyard surrounded by farmland, the kind of place where you can hear the wind through the corn. But it holds the grave of the man who has the most wins by a pitcher in Major League history, and likely always will. Denton Truce Cy Young won 511 games over a 22-year career that spanned from 1890 to 1911, playing for the Cleveland Spiders, the St. Louis Perfectos, the Boston Americans, the Cleveland Naps, and the Boston Rustlers. Nobody else is even close to that win total. Walter Johnson is second with 417. Young threw 3 no-hitters, including a perfect game in 1904, and he holds career records for games started, complete games, and innings pitched that are essentially untouchable in the modern era. Young got his nickname because his fastball was said to hit the backstop with the force of a cyclone. A sports writer shortened it to Cy, and the name stuck. He was a big, durable farm boy from Ohio who relied on a powerful arm and pinpoint control. After his career, he returned to his farm near Paoli, where he lived quietly until his death from a heart attack on November 4, 1955, at the age of 88. The annual award given to the best pitcher in each league, the Cy Young Award, has been presented since 1956, making his name one of the few in sports that every generation of fans knows, even if they couldn't tell you a single thing about the man himself. From rural Ohio, let's head to Pittsburgh and Jefferson Memorial Park in Pleasant Hills. The Steel City has a deep and proud baseball tradition, and among the many legends buried in the Pittsburgh area, we find Honus Wagner. John Peter Honus Wagner played 21 seasons in the major leagues from 1897 to 1917, almost entirely for the Pittsburgh Pirates. Many baseball historians consider him the greatest shortstop who ever played the game. He won 8 National League batting titles, compiled a .328 lifetime average, and was among the first 5 players inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1936, that inaugural class alongside Ruth, Cobb, Mathewson, and Walter Johnson. But Wagner might be even more famous today for something he had nothing to do with: a baseball card. The T206 Honus Wagner card, produced between 1909 and 1911 by the American Tobacco Company, is the most valuable baseball card in existence. Only a few dozen are known to survive, and one sold for over $7 million. The popular story is that Wagner demanded the card be pulled from production because he didn't want to encourage children to buy tobacco, though some historians dispute this. Either way, the scarcity of the card has made it the holy grail of sports memorabilia. Wagner died on December 6, 1955, at the age of 81, from natural causes. He had spent his later years coaching for the Pirates and was a beloved figure in Pittsburgh until the end. His grave here at Jefferson Memorial Park is a pilgrimage site for both baseball fans and card collectors alike. Just across town at Allegheny Cemetery, one of Pittsburgh's oldest and grandest burial grounds, we find another baseball legend, one whose story is both awe-inspiring and deeply unjust. Josh Gibson is sometimes called the Black Babe Ruth, though some who saw him play argued that Babe Ruth should be called the White Josh Gibson. Playing in the Negro Leagues from 1930 to 1946, primarily for the Homestead Grays and the Pittsburgh Crawfords, Gibson was the most feared power hitter in black baseball. His home run totals are the stuff of legend. Some accounts credit him with as many as 800 career home runs, though the exact number is impossible to verify due to incomplete record-keeping in the Negro Leagues. What is certain is that Gibson could hit a baseball as far as any human being who has ever lived. He is the only man known to have hit a fair ball completely out of Yankee Stadium. His contemporaries said his batting power was comparable to Ruth's or Mantle's, and his catching ability was outstanding. Gibson never got the chance to play in the major leagues. The color barrier kept him out, and by the time Jackie Robinson broke through in 1947, it was too late. Gibson died on January 20, 1947, just 3 months before Robinson's debut, of a stroke at the age of 35. He had struggled with depression, alcohol, and drug use in his later years, and some said he died of a broken heart, knowing he would never get the chance he deserved. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1972, and in 2024, Major League Baseball made the landmark decision to officially incorporate Negro League statistics into its records. When the numbers were crunched, Josh Gibson's career batting average topped them all. After 77 years, the record books finally told the truth. From Pittsburgh, let's travel to the nation's capital, or rather, just across the Potomac to Arlington, Virginia, and the hallowed grounds of Arlington National Cemetery. This is the most famous military burial ground in the world, and among its rows of white headstones lies one of the greatest heavyweight boxers who ever lived. Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, held the World Heavyweight Championship for nearly 12 years, from 1937 to 1949, the longest reign in the division's history. He successfully defended his title 25 times, a record that still stands. His most famous fight came on June 22, 1938, when he knocked out German boxer Max Schmeling in the first round at Yankee Stadium. With World War II on the horizon and Hitler using Schmeling as a symbol of Aryan superiority, Louis' devastating victory became one of the most symbolically important moments in American sports history, a black man defeating a supposed representative of the master race. Louis grew up in Detroit, the son of Alabama sharecroppers, and turned professional in 1934. He was beloved by Americans of all races, becoming the first African-American heavyweight champion since Jack Johnson, whom we'll visit later, had lost the title in 1915. During World War II, Louis enlisted in the Army and spent his service years doing exhibition bouts to boost troop morale. After retiring from boxing, Louis struggled financially, in part because the IRS came after him for back taxes on money he'd donated to military charities during the war. He spent his later years working as a greeter at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. Louis died of a cardiac arrest on April 12, 1981, at the age of 66. Though he was not killed in combat, his military service qualified him for burial at Arlington, and his friend Frank Sinatra helped arrange it. President Ronald Reagan waived the normal eligibility rules to make sure Louis received the honor. His grave is marked by a simple white headstone, like all the others at Arlington. A fitting tribute to a man who always let his fists do the talking. From Arlington, let's drive south to Richmond, Virginia and Woodland Cemetery, where another barrier-breaking athlete rests. Arthur Ashe was the first African-American man to win the U.S. Open, the first to win the Australian Open, and the first to win Wimbledon. He grew up in segregated Richmond, where he was denied access to the city's best tennis facilities because of his race. Undeterred, he practiced on the courts available to him and developed a game of remarkable intelligence and finesse. Ashe won the U.S. Open in 1968 as an amateur, the first and only man to do so in the Open era, and stunned the world by defeating the seemingly invincible Jimmy Connors to win Wimbledon in 1975. He was ranked number 1 in the world in 1975 and captained the U.S. Davis Cup team. But Ashe's significance extends far beyond tennis. He was a vocal opponent of apartheid in South Africa, was arrested outside the South African embassy in Washington during a protest, and wrote a 3-volume history of African American athletes called A Hard Road to Glory. In 1988, Ashe learned he had contracted HIV through a blood transfusion he received during heart surgery. He kept his diagnosis private until a reporter was about to break the story, at which point he went public and spent his remaining time as an advocate for AIDS research and education. Arthur Ashe died on February 6, 1993, at the age of 49. He is buried here at Woodland Cemetery in Richmond. The city that once wouldn't let him play on its tennis courts now honors him with a statue on Monument Avenue. The main stadium at the U.S. Open in New York is named Arthur Ashe Stadium, the largest tennis venue in the world. From Virginia, let's head to Tennessee, to the city of Clarksville, about 50 miles northwest of Nashville. Fossville Cemetery, in a historically black neighborhood, is the final resting place of a woman whose running changed what the world believed was possible. Wilma Rudolph was born prematurely in 1940, the 20th of 22 children in a family in Clarksville. As a young child, she contracted polio, which left her with a twisted left leg. She wore a brace until she was 9 and didn't walk without one until she was 12. Doctors told her she might never walk normally again. At the 1960 Summer Olympics in Rome, Wilma Rudolph became the first American woman to win 3 gold medals in a single Olympics. She won the 100 meters, the 200 meters, and anchored the 4x100 relay team, becoming an international sensation. The French press called her La Gazelle for her fluid, seemingly effortless stride. A girl who couldn't walk without a brace was now the fastest woman in the world. After the Olympics, Rudolph returned to Clarksville as a hero, but she insisted that her welcome home parade be open to all races, making it one of the first integrated public events in the city's history. She retired from track at 22, became a teacher and coach, and devoted much of her life to working with young people. Wilma Rudolph died of brain and throat cancer on November 12, 1994, at the age of 54. Her story remains one of the most inspiring in the history of sport, a triumph of will over circumstance that transcends athletics entirely. Let's head south and east now to North Carolina, and a stop that requires some discretion. Dale Earnhardt, the legendary NASCAR driver known as the Intimidator, was buried in a private ceremony following his death on February 18, 2001, in the final lap of the Daytona 500. The exact location of his burial near Mooresville, North Carolina, has been kept private by the Earnhardt family, and we'll respect that. But his story is too important to pass without mention. Earnhardt won 7 Winston Cup championships, tying Richard Petty's record, and 76 career races. He drove the iconic black No. 3 Chevrolet for Richard Childress Racing and was the most popular driver in NASCAR history. His aggressive driving style and his blue-collar persona made him a hero to millions of fans, particularly across the American South. Earnhardt's death at Daytona came when his car struck the outside wall on the final turn of the final lap. He was 59 years old. The impact was not visually dramatic. It looked, at first, like something he might walk away from. He did not. His death led to sweeping safety reforms across the sport, including mandatory use of the Hans device, improvements to barrier technology, and changes to car design that have since saved countless lives. Dale Earnhardt's legacy lives on in every safety innovation that has followed, and in the millions of fans who still display that black No. 3 on their cars, their hats, and their hearts. While we're in the Mooresville area, let's visit Glenwood Memorial Park, where another larger-than-life figure from the sports world rests. Reggie White was known as the Minister of Defense, a nickname that captured both his devastating play as a defensive end and his calling as an ordained Baptist minister. White played 15 seasons in the NFL, with the Philadelphia Eagles, the Green Bay Packers, and the Carolina Panthers, recording 198 career sacks, a record at the time of his retirement. He was a 13-time Pro Bowl selection and was named the NFL's Defensive Player of the Year twice. At 6'5" and nearly 300 pounds, White combined size with speed in a way that was almost unfair. His signature move, the hump, was a technique where he used one arm to lift an offensive lineman out of the way like a turnstile. Quarterbacks lived in fear of him. When White left Philadelphia for Green Bay as a free agent in 1993, his decision helped legitimize free agency in the NFL and convinced other star players that they could leave big markets for winning teams. Off the field, White was a community leader and a man of deep faith who worked to build bridges between races and communities. He died unexpectedly on December 26, 2004, of cardiac arrhythmia and a condition called sarcoidosis. He was only 43 years old. His death stunned the sports world. Reggie White was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2006. He played the game with a rare combination of power and grace, and his life off the field matched the standard he set on it. Now let's leave the Carolinas behind and head down to South Florida, to the town of Lauderdale Lakes and Forest Lawn Memorial Gardens. Here rests the only heavyweight champion in history to retire with a perfect record. Rocky Marciano fought 49 professional bouts and won every single one of them, 43 by knockout. Born Rocco Francis Marchigiano in Brockton, Massachusetts in 1923, he was the son of Italian immigrants and grew up tough in a factory town during the Depression. He tried baseball first, earning a tryout with the Chicago Cubs organization, but he didn't make the cut. Boxing, it turned out, was his calling. Marciano won the heavyweight title from Jersey Joe Walcott in 1952 with a devastating 13th-round knockout after trailing on the scorecards. He defended the title 6 times, including a first-round demolition of Walcott in the rematch and 2 brutal fights against Ezzard Charles. His style was relentless. He wasn't the most technically polished boxer, but his stamina, his chin, and his crushing right hand wore opponents down like a jackhammer. Joe Louis, whom we visited at Arlington, came out of retirement to fight Marciano in 1951 and was knocked through the ropes in the 8th round. Marciano was so upset about beating his childhood hero that he wept in Louis' dressing room afterward. Marciano retired in 1956 at the age of 32, with his perfect record intact, and he never fought again. On August 31, 1969, The night before his 46th birthday, he was a passenger in a small private plane flying through bad weather near Newton, Iowa. The plane crashed into a tree on approach, killing all 3 on board. Rocky Marciano was 45 years old. His undefeated record remains one of the most remarkable achievements in boxing history, and no heavyweight champion has matched it since. From Florida, let's fly all the way across the country to the San Francisco Bay Area, to the small town of Colma, California, a place that bills itself, with a straight face, as a city where the dead outnumber the living by 1,000 to 1. When San Francisco banned new burials within city limits around the turn of the 20th century, Colma became the final destination. Over 1 million people are buried here, spread across 17 cemeteries. One of them, Holy Cross Catholic Cemetery, holds the remains of the Yankee Clipper himself. Joe DiMaggio grew up playing sandlot baseball in San Francisco's North Beach neighborhood, the 8th of 9 children born to Sicilian immigrants. He signed with the hometown San Francisco Seals before the Yankees brought him east, and from 1936 to 1951, he was the most elegant player in the game. His 56-game hitting streak in 1941 remains one of the most unassailable records in all of sports. He won 3 American League Most Valuable Player awards, led the Yankees to 9 World Series championships in his 13 seasons, and did it all with a grace that made the most difficult plays look routine. DiMaggio's fame extended well beyond the diamond. His marriage to Marilyn Monroe in 1954 was a national sensation. They wed right here in San Francisco at City Hall. The marriage lasted less than a year, but DiMaggio's devotion to Monroe outlived her. After her death in 1962, he arranged her funeral and had 6 red roses delivered to her crypt 3 times a week for 20 years. He never remarried. After retiring from baseball, DiMaggio became a private, even reclusive figure. He insisted on being introduced at public events as baseball's greatest living player, and few argued the point. He died of complications from lung cancer surgery on March 8, 1999, at the age of 84 at his home in Hollywood, Florida. His funeral was held at the Church of Saints Peter and Paul in North Beach, the same church where he'd been married. He was laid to rest here at Holy Cross in the family plot, back in the city where it all began. Simon and Garfunkel once asked, "Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio?" The answer, it turns out, was home. Staying in the Los Angeles area, let's head south to Inglewood Park Cemetery, just outside LA near the old Forum where the Lakers once played. This sprawling cemetery is the final resting place for entertainers like Ella Fitzgerald and Ray Charles, but we're here for a fighter, one who many consider the greatest pound-for-pound boxer who ever lived. Sugar Ray Robinson held the world welterweight title and won the middleweight championship 5 times between 1951 and 1958. His record of 175 wins, 19 losses, and 6 draws over a career that stretched from 1940 to 1965 is remarkable enough. But it was the way Robinson fought that set him apart. He combined speed, power, footwork, and ring intelligence in a package that no other fighter could match. Muhammad Ali, whom we'll close our tour with, called Robinson the king, the master, my idol. Every great boxer who came after him was measured against Sugar Ray Robinson, and most came up short. Robinson was born Walker Smith Jr. in Detroit and raised in Harlem. He got his famous name by borrowing the amateur boxing card of a friend named Ray Robinson so he could enter a fight underage. The sugar was added by a sports writer who called his style sweet as sugar. Outside the ring, Robinson was a Harlem celebrity who owned a nightclub, a barbershop, and a dry cleaning business, all on the same block. He traveled with an entourage that included a hairdresser, a valet, and a flamingo pink Cadillac. Robinson's later years were marked by financial difficulties and declining health. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and spent his final years largely out of the public eye. He died on April 12, 1989, at the age of 67. His grave here at Inglewood Park is visited by boxing fans who know that before Ali, before Leonard, before Mayweather, there was Sugar Ray, the original, and to many, the best there ever was. Let's drive northeast to Glendale and Forest Lawn Memorial Park, the most famous cemetery in America. Forest Lawn is the final resting place for a dazzling roster of Hollywood legends, from Clark Gable to Walt Disney. But tucked among the stars of the silver screen, we find a man whose stage was the baseball diamond. Charles Dillon Casey Stengel managed in the major leagues for 25 seasons and won 7 World Series titles with the New York Yankees between 1949 and 1960, including an unprecedented 5 in a row from 1949 to 1953. Before that, he'd been a journeyman outfielder with a .284 career average and a gift for entertaining. He once tipped his cap to a heckling crowd and a bird flew out. But it was as a manager and a talker that Stengel became a national treasure. He spoke in a rambling, circuitous style that sports writers dubbed Stengelese, a stream of consciousness monologue that somehow circled back to make a sharp point when you least expected it. When called to testify before a Senate subcommittee investigating baseball's antitrust exemption in 1958, Stengel delivered a response so convoluted that the senators were left in bewildered silence. Mickey Mantle, who testified next, was asked for his views. "My views are about the same as Casey's," Mantle said. After the Yankees fired him following the 1960 World Series, they said he was too old at 70, Stengel was hired to manage the brand-new New York Mets, one of the worst expansion teams ever assembled. He managed them with the same energy he'd brought to the Yankees, cheerfully presiding over a team that lost 120 games in its first season. "Can't anybody here play this game?" he reportedly asked. Stengel was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1966 and died on September 29, 1975, at the age of 85, from cancer. He rests here at Forest Lawn, in a cemetery where he's surrounded by performers, which, when you think about it, is exactly where Casey Stengel belongs. From Glendale, let's head south into Orange County to El Toro Memorial Park in Lake Forest. Here lies a woman who didn't just run fast, she redefined what fast looked like. Florence Griffith Joyner, FloJo, burst onto the world stage at the 1988 Seoul Olympics, winning 3 gold medals and a silver. Her times in the 100 meters and 200 meters at the U.S. Olympic trials that summer remain the world records to this day, more than 35 years later. The 100-meter record of 10.49 seconds is so far ahead of any other woman's time that many track experts believe it may never be broken. FloJo was as famous for her style as for her speed. She ran in one-legged bodysuits and with 6-inch painted fingernails that became her trademark. Her appearance at the 1988 trials, after years as a good but not great sprinter, was so sudden and so dominant that it invited suspicion. Whispers about performance-enhancing drugs followed her for the rest of her life. She was never found to have violated any anti-doping rules, and she retired from competitive running in 1989. Griffith Joyner was married to Al Joyner, an Olympic triple jump champion, and was the sister-in-law of Jackie Joyner Kersee, considered by many the greatest female athlete ever. She pursued careers in fashion design and acting after leaving track and field. On September 21, 1998, FloJo was found dead in her bed at her home in Mission Viejo, California. She had suffocated during an epileptic seizure in her sleep. She was only 38 years old. Her world records endure as monuments to a talent that arrived like a comet. Brilliant, dazzling, and far too brief. Staying along the Southern California coast, let's make our way to Corona del Mar and Pacific View Memorial Park, perched on a bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. It's a setting of extraordinary beauty, and it's where Kobe Bryant was laid to rest. Kobe Bean Bryant spent his entire 20-year NBA career with the Los Angeles Lakers, winning 5 championships, earning 18 All-Star selections, and scoring 81 points in a single game against the Toronto Raptors in 2006, the second highest single-game total in NBA history. He retired in 2016 as the third leading scorer in NBA history, and on the night of his final game, he poured in 60 points in a vintage farewell performance that brought the Staples Center to its feet. Bryant was the son of former NBA player Joe "Jellybean" Bryant and grew up partly in Italy, where his father played professionally. He entered the NBA straight out of high school at 17, and within a few years, he and Shaquille O'Neal formed the most dominant duo in basketball, leading the Lakers to 3 consecutive titles from 2000 to 2002. After O'Neal's departure, Bryant won 2 more championships largely on his own ferocious will, earning Finals MVP honors in both 2009 and 2010. His relentless work ethic, he famously practiced at 4 a.m., became known as the Mamba mentality, after the nickname he gave himself, Black Mamba. On January 26, 2020, Bryant, his 13-year-old daughter Gianna, and 7 others were killed when their helicopter crashed into a hillside in Calabasas, California during foggy conditions. Bryant was 41 years old. The grief that swept across Los Angeles and the world was staggering in its intensity. Murals appeared overnight on buildings across the city. The Staples Center became a sea of flowers, jerseys, and candles. He rests here at Pacific View, overlooking the ocean he loved. From Southern California, let's take a very different kind of trip, to Las Vegas, Nevada, and Paradise Memorial Gardens. Among the flat markers and modest headstones in this unremarkable cemetery on the eastern edge of the city lies one of the most mysterious figures in boxing history. Charles L. Sonny Liston was a fearsome heavyweight champion whose early life reads like a blues song set in a minor key. He was born into poverty in Arkansas. He didn't even know his own birthday, and various records list different years of birth. He learned to box in prison while serving time for armed robbery. After his release, he fought his way to the top with a devastating left jab and punishing power, winning the heavyweight title from Floyd Patterson with a first-round knockout in 1962. Then came the fight that changed everything. On February 25, 1964, a brash young challenger named Cassius Clay, the man we'll end our tour with, defeated Liston in Miami Beach when Liston failed to answer the bell for the 7th round, claiming a shoulder injury. The rematch in Lewiston, Maine, was even more bizarre. Liston went down in the first round from a punch that many spectators never even saw. The Phantom Punch remains one of the most debated moments in sports history, with persistent allegations that the fight was fixed. After the Clay losses, Liston continued to fight but never recaptured the title. He settled in Las Vegas, where he was found dead in his home on January 5, 1971. His wife had been away, and his body may have lain undiscovered for several days. The official cause of death was lung congestion and heart failure, though the circumstances were suspicious enough that many, including the local police, believed he had died of a heroin overdose. He was approximately 38 years old, though even that is uncertain. Sonny Liston lived in shadows and died in mystery. His grave here in Las Vegas is marked by a simple flat stone. From Vegas, let's take a long journey down to the Gulf Coast, to Galveston, Texas and Galveston Memorial Park. Here we find a man whose boxing career predates Liston's, Louis' and Ali's, and whose story encompasses some of the ugliest and most courageous chapters in American sports. Jack Johnson became the first African-American world heavyweight boxing champion on December 26, 1908, when he defeated Tommy Burns in Sydney, Australia. His victory was met with outrage among white Americans, and the search for a great white hope to dethrone him became a national obsession. When former champion James J. Jeffries came out of retirement to challenge Johnson in Reno in 1910, Johnson demolished him in 15 rounds. Race riots erupted across the country that night. Johnson was as flamboyant as he was talented. He drove fast cars, dressed extravagantly, and openly dated and married white women at a time when such relationships could get a black man killed. In 1913, he was convicted under the Mann Act, a law prohibiting the transport of women across state lines for immoral purposes, in a prosecution widely seen as racially motivated. Rather than go to prison, Johnson fled the country and lived in exile for 7 years before returning to serve his sentence. Johnson lost his title in 1915 to Jess Willard in Havana, Cuba, in a 26-round fight under the blazing sun. He always claimed he threw the fight as part of a deal to have his legal troubles dropped, and a famous photograph showing him on his back, apparently shielding his eyes from the sun, has fueled that debate for over a century. Johnson died on June 10, 1946, at the age of 68 when he lost control of his car on a highway near Franklinton, North Carolina. In 2018, 72 years after his death, President Donald Trump issued a posthumous pardon for the Mann Act conviction. Jack Johnson lies here in Galveston, the city where he grew up, a man who was too far ahead of his time for the world to handle. Let's travel up the coast now to Greenville, South Carolina, and Woodlawn Memorial Park. This is the final resting place of one of baseball's most controversial and enduring figures. Shoeless Joe Jackson played 13 seasons in the major leagues and compiled a lifetime batting average of .356, the third highest in history, behind only Ty Cobb and Rogers Hornsby. Babe Ruth reportedly modeled his batting swing after Jackson's. He was, by all accounts, one of the most naturally gifted hitters the game has ever seen. But Jackson's name will forever be linked to the 1919 Black Sox scandal, in which 8 members of the Chicago White Sox were accused of deliberately losing the World Series to the Cincinnati Reds in exchange for money from gamblers. Jackson was among those banned from baseball for life by Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis, even though the players were acquitted in a criminal trial. The debate over Jackson's guilt or innocence has raged for more than a century. His supporters point to his outstanding performance in the 1919 series. He hit .375, the highest average of any player on either team, as evidence that he played to win. His detractors note that he accepted money from the fixers, even if he later tried to return it. Jackson returned to Greenville after his banishment and ran a dry cleaning business and a liquor store. He lived quietly, largely out of the public eye, until his death from a heart attack on December 5, 1951, at the age of 64. The story of the little boy who supposedly pleaded with Jackson after the scandal, "Say it ain't so, Joe," may or may not have actually happened, but it endures because it captures the heartbreak of lost innocence. Jackson's exclusion from the Hall of Fame remains one of the most debated injustices in sports, and his grave here in Greenville is a place where that debate continues, one visitor at a time. From South Carolina, let's return to the Chicago area for a story that touched the heart of a nation. St. Mary Cemetery in Evergreen Park, just south of the city, is where we find Brian Piccolo. If you're of a certain age, you remember the movie, Brian's Song, the 1971 made-for-television film that is still considered one of the greatest sports movies ever made. It told the true story of the friendship between Piccolo, a white running back, and Gale Sayers, a black running back, as teammates on the Chicago Bears in the 1960s. At a time of deep racial tension in America, their bond crossed the color line in a way that felt both remarkable and utterly natural. Piccolo was a solid, if unspectacular, player who signed with the Bears as an undrafted free agent in 1965. He became Sayers' roommate, making them the first interracial roommate pair in the history of the NFL. When Sayers suffered a devastating knee injury in 1968, Piccolo helped him through his rehabilitation, pushing him, encouraging him, running alongside him. Then it was Piccolo who needed help. In 1969, he was diagnosed with embryonal cell carcinoma, an aggressive form of cancer. He fought the disease with extraordinary courage, but it was a fight he could not win. Brian Piccolo died on June 16, 1970, at the age of 26. At an awards banquet shortly before Piccolo's death, Sayers accepted a Courage Award and, in tears, dedicated it to his friend. "I love Brian Piccolo," Sayers told the audience, "and I'd like all of you to love him too." It was a moment, and a friendship, that reminded the country of what was possible when people saw each other as human beings first. From Chicago, let's travel south to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Rest Haven Gardens of Memory. Here lies a basketball player whose talent was so extraordinary that fans who saw him play still shake their heads in disbelief. Pete Maravich, Pistol Pete, scored more points in college basketball than anyone in history. averaging an almost incomprehensible 44.2 points per game over 3 seasons at Louisiana State University, from 1967 to 1970. He did this without the benefit of the three-point line, which wasn't adopted in college basketball until 1986. If his shots had been counted under modern rules, his scoring average would have been even higher. He was a wizard with the ball, a showman whose behind-the-back passes, between-the-legs dribbles, and no-look dishes electrified audiences years before Magic Johnson brought that style to the NBA. Maravich was drafted first overall by the Atlanta Hawks in 1970 and went on to play 10 NBA seasons, mostly with the Hawks and the New Orleans Jazz, now the Utah Jazz. He led the league in scoring in 1977 and was a 5-time All-Star. But he never won a championship, and chronic knee injuries forced him to retire at the age of 32. After basketball, Maravich withdrew from public life and battled depression before becoming a devout born-again Christian. On January 5, 1988, while playing in a pickup basketball game at a church gym in Pasadena, California, he collapsed and died of a heart attack. He was 40 years old. An autopsy revealed a stunning fact. Maravich had been born without a left coronary artery, a congenital defect that should have killed him much earlier. The fact that he played professional basketball at the highest level with this condition, essentially running on half a heart, makes his career even more extraordinary than it already appeared. Pistol Pete was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1987, a year before his death. Let's head north now to the suburbs of Washington, D.C., to Rockville, Maryland and Rockville Cemetery, a small, historic burial ground with headstones dating back to the 1700s. Among them is the grave of a man they called the Big Train. Walter Johnson pitched for the Washington Senators for 21 seasons, from 1907 to 1927, and he did it with a fastball so overpowering that batters routinely said they simply couldn't see the pitch. He won 417 games, second only to Cy Young, whom we visited earlier in Ohio, and struck out 3,509 batters, a record that stood for over 50 years. He threw 110 career shutouts, a record that will almost certainly never be broken. He led the league in strikeouts 12 times and in earned run average 5 times. The remarkable thing about Johnson's career is that he achieved all of this while pitching for a perennially weak team. The old joke about Washington, first in war, first in peace, and last in the American League, applied to virtually Johnson's entire tenure. He had little run support, few capable teammates, and yet he won, and won, and won. When the Senators finally reached the World Series in 1924, Johnson lost his first 2 starts but came on in relief in Game 7 and pitched 4 scoreless innings to earn the win. He was 36 years old, and Washington had its only championship. After retiring, Johnson managed the Senators and the Indians, and then returned to his farm in Maryland. He ran unsuccessfully for Congress in 1940 as a Republican. Walter Johnson died of a brain tumor on December 10, 1946, at the age of 59. He was one of the 5 original inductees into the Hall of Fame in 1936. His grave here at Rockville is simple and unadorned, just like the man himself, who let his right arm speak for him. From Maryland, let's go to central Pennsylvania, to the college town of Lewisburg, home of Bucknell University. Lewisburg Cemetery, a peaceful hillside burial ground, is where we find one of those 5 original Hall of Famers, and a man whose story carries a weight beyond baseball. Christy Mathewson won 373 games for the New York Giants between 1900 and 1916, and he did it with a combination of intelligence, pinpoint control, and a pitch called the fadeaway, what we'd now call a screwball. He was the most popular player of the deadball era, a handsome, college-educated gentleman in a sport dominated by rough-hewn characters. He won 30 or more games in 3 consecutive seasons and pitched 3 shutouts in the 1905 World Series, a feat no one has matched. But Mathewson's life took a tragic turn that had nothing to do with baseball. During World War I, he enlisted in the Army and was sent to France as a captain in the Chemical Warfare Service. During a training exercise, he was exposed to poison gas, which severely damaged his lungs. He returned home weakened and spent years battling tuberculosis at a sanatorium in Saranac Lake, New York. Christy Mathewson died on October 7, 1925, at the age of 45. A war casualty as surely as any soldier killed on the front lines. His death hit the baseball world hard. The 1925 World Series was underway when he died, and players on both teams wore black armbands in his honor. He rests here in Lewisburg, where he'd attended Bucknell as a young man. The college boy who became a pitching legend and then a war hero, his story encompasses the best and worst of the early 20th century. Let's head now to the Orlando area in Florida for a golfer whose life was cut short in one of the most shocking moments in modern sports. Payne Stewart won 11 PGA Tour events, including 3 major championships: the PGA Championship in 1989 and the U.S. Open in both 1991 and 1999. He was known for his +4s, the old-fashioned knickers and tam o' shanter cap that made him one of the most recognizable figures on the tour. He was also known for a competitive fire that burned hot, most memorably in the 1999 U.S. Open at Pinehurst, where he sank a 15-foot par putt on the final hole to win by 1 stroke. The image of Stewart pumping his fist after that putt became one of the iconic photographs in golf history. Just 4 months later, on October 25, 1999, Stewart boarded a Learjet in Orlando bound for the Tour Championship in Houston. Shortly after takeoff, the plane lost cabin pressure, incapacitating everyone on board. The jet flew on autopilot for hours, ghosting across the middle of the country at 45,000 feet, while military fighter jets trailed helplessly alongside. Eventually, the plane ran out of fuel and crashed in a field near Mena, South Dakota. All 6 on board were killed. Payne Stewart was 42 years old. The PGA Tour was devastated. Stewart had been at the peak of his career, having just won the U.S. Open, and he'd recently spoken publicly about a deepening Christian faith and a renewed commitment to his family. He was buried in Orlando, the city he called home. The PGA Tour established the Payne Stewart Award in his honor, given annually to a player who best represents the values of respect, charity, and sportsmanship. His memorial remains a gathering place for golf fans who remember the man in the knickers, the showman who backed it up when it counted most. Let's stay in Texas for our next stop, Austin specifically, and the Hornsby Bend Cemetery in far eastern Travis County. This little rural graveyard sits on land that once belonged to the family of one of the greatest hitters in baseball history, which is how Rogers Hornsby ended up here. Hornsby's lifetime batting average of .358 is the highest in National League history and second overall only to Ty Cobb. Over the course of 23 seasons, mostly with the St. Louis Cardinals, Hornsby won 7 batting titles, including a staggering 6 in a row from 1920 to 1925. His .424 average in 1924 is the highest single-season mark of the 20th century. A number so extraordinary, it almost seems like a typo. Hornsby was as difficult a personality as he was a brilliant hitter. He was blunt, tactless, and almost universally disliked by teammates, managers, and owners. He was traded repeatedly despite being one of the best players alive, simply because nobody could stand working with him. He was also a compulsive gambler, a habit that would cause him trouble throughout his career and after. As a manager, he won a World Series with the Cardinals in 1926 and was fired the following year after clashing with the team's front office. After his playing career, Hornsby bounced around as a manager and scout, never quite finding a permanent home. He died of a heart attack on January 5, 1963, at the age of 66. His family's old homestead in Hornsby Bend, just outside Austin, is where he was buried, a rural resting place for a man who made his living in major league cities but whose roots were in the Texas dirt. From Texas, let's travel to the hills of West Virginia, to the small city of Martinsburg and Rosedale Cemetery. This is where we find a man whose story is one of baseball's saddest and one of its most redemptive. Louis Robert "Hack" Wilson stood just 5 feet 6 inches tall, but weighed a stocky 190 pounds, with enormous shoulders and an 18-inch neck. He looked like a fire hydrant in a baseball uniform. And in 1930, playing for the Chicago Cubs, Wilson had one of the most extraordinary offensive seasons in the history of the sport. He drove in 191 runs that year, a record that has stood for nearly a century and shows no sign of falling. He also hit 56 home runs, a National League record that lasted until 1998. But Wilson's career cratered almost as quickly as it had soared. Alcohol was the culprit. He drank heavily throughout his playing years, and when his production declined, teams cut him loose. By the mid-1930s, the man who had been one of the most feared hitters in baseball was out of the game entirely. He drifted into poverty, working odd jobs, including a stint as a bartender, and living in a rooming house in Baltimore. Wilson died on November 23, 1948, at the age of 48. He was so destitute that his body went unclaimed for 3 days. When his plight became known, contributions came in from the National League, from former teammates, and from fans who remembered what he'd been. They paid for his burial here in Martinsburg and erected a substantial granite memorial. Wilson was posthumously inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1979. Sometimes the game forgets its own, but sometimes it also remembers and makes things right. Let's head to Philadelphia now, and Ivy Hill Cemetery, a historic burial ground in the Cedarbrook neighborhood. Here rests a man who gave Muhammad Ali 2 of the toughest fights of his life. Smokin' Joe Frazier was the undisputed world heavyweight champion from 1970 to 1973, and his rivalry with Ali is the greatest in boxing history. The first fight, on March 8, 1971, billed as the fight of the century at Madison Square Garden, saw 2 undefeated heavyweights battle for 15 rounds. Frazier won a unanimous decision, flooring Ali in the 15th round with a thunderous left hook. It was Ali's first professional loss. The two would fight twice more. A close Ali decision in 1974, and then the legendary Thrilla in Manila in 1975. A fight so brutal that both men were never quite the same afterward. Ali won when Frazier's trainer, Eddie Futch, stopped the fight before the 15th round, but Ali later said it was the closest thing to dying he had ever experienced. Frazier grew up in Beaufort, South Carolina, one of 13 children, and worked in a Philadelphia slaughterhouse while training to box. He won the Olympic heavyweight gold medal in Tokyo in 1964, fighting the final bout with a broken left thumb, and turned professional the following year. His relentless brawling style was the perfect counterpoint to Ali's dancing and jabbing, and their trilogy defined an era. After boxing, Frazier ran a gym in Philadelphia and managed fighters. He carried bitterness toward Ali for years, hurt by the taunts and ridicule Ali had heaped on him to sell their fights, though the two eventually reconciled in their later years. Joe Frazier died of liver cancer on November 7, 2011, at the age of 67. He rests here in Philadelphia, the city that adopted him and that he made his own, a working man's champion in a working man's town. Just a short drive from Philadelphia in Orange, New Jersey, we find Rosedale Cemetery and the final resting place of a woman who broke barriers in tennis decades before Arthur Ashe picked up a racket. Althea Gibson was the first African American to win a Grand Slam title, capturing the French Championships in 1956, followed by consecutive Wimbledon and U.S. national titles in 1957 and 1958. In all, she won 11 major titles in singles and doubles. She was named Female Athlete of the Year by the Associated Press in both 1957 and 1958. Gibson grew up in Harlem, the daughter of sharecroppers who had moved north from South Carolina. She was a streetwise kid who played paddle tennis on the sidewalks before discovering a talent for the real thing. The American Tennis Association, the black tennis organization, nurtured her talent, but the white-run United States Lawn Tennis Association initially refused to let her compete. It was only through the advocacy of former champion Alice Marble, who wrote an editorial condemning the exclusion, that Gibson was finally allowed to enter the U.S. Nationals at Forest Hills in 1950. After tennis, Gibson became the first black woman to join the LPGA Tour, playing professional golf. She also had a brief acting career and recorded a music album. Her later years were marked by financial hardship and failing health. She suffered a stroke and lived in near poverty until friends, including former rival Angela Buxton, helped provide for her care. Althea Gibson died on September 28, 2003, at the age of 76. Like so many pioneers, she opened doors that others walked through to far greater fame and fortune, and she deserved more recognition than she received in her lifetime. From New Jersey, let's go to Baltimore's northern suburbs to Dulaney Valley Memorial Gardens in Timonium, Maryland. This is where we find the quarterback who, more than any other, shaped the modern passing game. Johnny Unitas played for the Baltimore Colts from 1956 to 1972 and was named the greatest football player of all time by the Sporting News. His signature achievement was a streak of 47 consecutive games with at least one touchdown pass, a record that stood for over 50 years until Drew Brees broke it in 2012. He was a 3-time NFL Most Valuable Player, a 10-time Pro Bowl selection, and the leader of one of the most famous games ever played. That game was the 1958 NFL Championship, the Colts versus the New York Giants at Yankee Stadium on December 28th. Unitas drove the Colts down the field in the final minutes of regulation to tie the game and then led them to a touchdown in sudden death overtime to win it. The game, nationally televised, has been called the greatest game ever played, and it's widely credited with launching professional football into the television age. More than any single event, that game, and Unitas's poise under pressure, turned the NFL from a second-tier sport into America's obsession. Unitas was born in Pittsburgh and was so lightly regarded coming out of college at Louisville that the Pittsburgh Steelers cut him. He worked construction and played semi-pro football for $6 a game before the Colts gave him a chance. The flat-top haircut, the black high-top cleats, the stoic demeanor. Unitas looked like a man from another era even when he was playing, and his influence on the position is immeasurable. He died of a heart attack on September 11, 2002, at the age of 69. For a generation of football fans, Johnny U was the quarterback against whom all others were measured. Now for something a little different. Our next two stops aren't for people at all. They're for horses. And before you raise an eyebrow, consider this. Few athletes of any species have captured the American imagination the way these two thoroughbreds did. Let's go to Kentucky. At Claiborne Farm in Paris, Kentucky, beneath the bluegrass of the rolling horse country, lies Secretariat, the horse that many consider the greatest racehorse who ever lived. In 1973, Big Red won the Triple Crown in a fashion so emphatic that the racing world still talks about it in hushed tones. He won the Kentucky Derby by 2.5 lengths. He won the Preakness by 2.5 lengths. And then, at the Belmont Stakes, he won by 31 lengths. A margin so absurd that the track announcer simply shouted, "He is moving like a tremendous machine," as Secretariat galloped into immortality. His time of 2:24 for 1.5 miles still stands as the Belmont record, more than 50 years later. Secretariat was syndicated for breeding after his Triple Crown and spent his remaining years at Claiborne Farm. He developed laminitis, a painful hoof condition, and was euthanized on October 4, 1989, at the age of 19. A necropsy revealed that his heart was nearly twice the size of a normal horse's heart, estimated at 22 pounds. He had, quite literally, more heart than any horse that ever ran. About 30 miles west, at the Kentucky Horse Park in Lexington, we find the burial site of Secretariat's great predecessor. Man o' War raced in 1919 and 1920, winning 20 of his 21 career starts with such dominance that he was the most famous horse in America for decades. Man o' War was the son of a stallion named Fairplay and a mare named Mahuba. His owner, Samuel Riddle, chose not to enter him in the Kentucky Derby, a decision that remains one of the great what-ifs in racing history. But Man o' War won the Preakness and the Belmont, among other major races. His lone defeat came at the hands of a horse aptly named Upset, in a race where Man o' War was facing the wrong direction at the start and still nearly caught up. After retirement, Man o' War became a legendary sire, producing champion offspring for years. He died on November 1st, 1947, at the age of 30. His funeral drew more than 2,000 mourners, and his body was embalmed and placed in a specially built casket lined with his racing colors. He was originally buried at Faraway Farm, but his remains were later moved to the Kentucky Horse Park, where a bronze statue marks his grave. For those who love the sport of kings, this is sacred ground. From the horse country of Kentucky, let's head all the way to the Pacific Northwest, to Seattle, Washington, and Lakeview Cemetery on Capitol Hill, with its commanding views of Lake Washington, the Cascade Mountains, and Mount Rainier. It's an appropriate setting for a man who moved like no one else on earth. Bruce Lee was born in San Francisco in 1940, raised in Hong Kong, and returned to the United States as a teenager. He studied philosophy at the University of Washington. He's buried here in Seattle because it's where he went to college and where he began teaching martial arts. Lee developed his own fighting style, Jeet Kune Do, rejecting rigid traditional forms in favor of a fluid, adaptive approach that drew from boxing, fencing, Wing Chun, and a half-dozen other disciplines. He was, in every sense, a martial artist, someone who elevated fighting into art. Lee's film career made him a global phenomenon. His starring roles in The Big Boss, Fist of Fury, Way of the Dragon, and Enter the Dragon transformed martial arts movies from a niche genre into worldwide blockbusters. Enter the Dragon, released in 1973, is still considered the gold standard of the genre. Lee's physical abilities, his speed, his power, his one-inch punch, seemed almost superhuman, and they were backed by a philosophy of self-improvement and personal expression that influenced athletes in every discipline. On July 20th, 1973, while in Hong Kong preparing for his next film, Bruce Lee died of cerebral edema, a swelling of the brain, at the age of 32. The cause was attributed to an allergic reaction to a painkiller. His death stunned the world. Lee's son, Brandon, himself a promising actor, is buried beside him. Brandon was killed by a defective prop gun on the set of The Crow in 1993, at the age of 28. Father and son rest side by side on this Seattle hilltop, their graves among the most visited in the city. Let's head back east now and south to the island of Puerto Rico. In the municipality of Carolina, just outside San Juan, stands a memorial to a man whose life and death embodied the very best of what an athlete can be. Roberto Clemente played 18 seasons for the Pittsburgh Pirates from 1955 to 1972 and was one of the most complete players the game has ever seen. He won 4 National League batting titles, 12 Gold Glove awards, and was named the World Series Most Valuable Player in 1971, when his performance in the Pirates' 7-game victory over the Baltimore Orioles was nothing short of magnificent. On September 30th, 1972, in the final game of the regular season, he collected his 3,000th hit, the last hit of his career, and a milestone only 10 other players had reached at the time. But Clemente's story transcends statistics. He was a proud Puerto Rican who spoke openly about the discrimination he faced as a Latin American player in the United States. He was deeply committed to humanitarian causes, and on December 31, 1972, he boarded a cargo plane in San Juan loaded with relief supplies for earthquake victims in Nicaragua. The overloaded DC-7 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean shortly after takeoff. Clemente's body was never recovered. He was 38 years old. The impact of his death was felt across the Americas. The Baseball Hall of Fame waived its customary 5-year waiting period and inducted Clemente immediately. Major League Baseball's annual award for community service bears his name. Here in Carolina, a memorial honors his life and his sacrifice. Roberto Clemente didn't just play baseball. He used his platform to serve others, and he gave his life doing it. From the Caribbean, let's head to the Deep South, to Bond, Mississippi. a rural community near Wiggins, in the piney woods of southern Mississippi. Bond Cemetery is a small, modest country graveyard, and in it rests a man who pitched with as much personality as anyone who ever took the mound. J. Hannah "Dizzy" Dean won 150 games in a career that was cut short by injury, but in his prime, from 1932 to 1937, he was the most dominant and entertaining pitcher in baseball. In 1934, pitching for the St. Louis Cardinals Gas House Gang, Dean won 30 games, the last National League pitcher to reach that mark. His brother Paul, known as Daffy, won 19 games that same year, and the two combined to win all 4 of the Cardinals' victories in the World Series. Dean was a master storyteller and self-promoter with a thick Arkansas drawl. "It ain't bragging if you can back it up," he liked to say, and he backed it up plenty. After a toe injury in the 1937 All-Star Game altered his pitching motion and led to an arm injury, Dean's playing career fizzled out. But his second career, as a radio and television broadcaster, was almost as legendary. He mangled the English language with joyful abandon, once saying a runner "slud" into third base. When school teachers complained about his grammar, Dean replied, "A lot of folks who ain't saying ain't eatin'." Dizzy Dean died of a heart attack on July 17, 1974, at the age of 63, at his home in Reno, Nevada. He was brought back to Mississippi, to this little cemetery in Bond, and buried in the country that made him. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1953. From Mississippi, let's return to Kentucky, to Louisville and Rest Haven Cemetery. Here, we find a man who played a quieter but essential role in one of baseball's most important moments. Harold P. Wee Reese was the shortstop for the Brooklyn Dodgers from 1940 to 1958. A 10-time All-Star and a key member of the teams that won 7 National League pennants and the 1955 World Series, the only championship the Dodgers ever won in Brooklyn. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1984. But Reese's greatest moment didn't involve a bat or a glove. In 1947, when Jackie Robinson, whom we visited earlier in Brooklyn, joined the Dodgers and faced a torrent of abuse, it was Reese, a white Southerner from Louisville, who publicly stood beside him. The most famous version of the story says that during a game in Cincinnati, with fans hurling racial slurs at Robinson, Reese walked over and put his arm around Robinson's shoulder, silencing the crowd. Whether the details of that specific moment are exact, the larger truth is undeniable. Reese's acceptance of Robinson, at a time when many of his teammates were circulating a petition to keep Robinson off the team, was an act of moral courage that helped change the game and the country. Reese died of cancer on August 14, 1999, at the age of 81. He rests here in Louisville, the city he grew up in, a place where, as a young man, segregation was the law of the land. He lived long enough to see the world he helped create, a world where Robinson's number 42 hangs in every ballpark. Staying in the South, let's visit Hot Springs, Virginia, a small resort town nestled in the Allegheny Mountains, famous for its mineral springs and its genteel charm. Sam Snead, one of the greatest golfers in history, was born and raised nearby and is buried in the cemetery here. Samuel Jackson Snead won 82 PGA Tour events, the most in history, a record that still stands. He won 7 major championships, including 3 Masters titles, 3 PGA championships, and 1 Open championship. His swing was so fluid and natural that Ben Hogan, his great rival, once said Snead had the most natural golf swing I've ever seen. Where Hogan was mechanical and precise, Snead was instinctive and graceful, a self-taught player from the mountains of Virginia who could hit a golf ball with his bare feet and still outdrive most professionals. Snead's one great frustration was the U.S. Open, which he never won despite finishing second 4 times, often in heartbreaking fashion. At the 1939 U.S. Open, he needed only a par on the final hole to win and took a triple bogey instead. It haunted him for the rest of his life. Off the course, Snead was a legendary storyteller and a notorious tightwad. The joke was that he kept his money in tin cans buried in his yard, though his actual investments were considerably more sophisticated. He continued to play competitively well into his 60s and was the oldest player to make a cut on the PGA Tour at age 67. Sam Snead died on May 23, 2002, at the age of 89, just 4 days before the start of that year's tournament at his beloved Greenbrier Resort. He was the last of the great triumvirate, Snead, Hogan, and Byron Nelson, who defined professional golf in the middle of the 20th century. From the mountains of Virginia, let's return to Ohio, to Springfield and Ferncliff Cemetery. This large, well-maintained burial ground is the resting place of many Springfield residents. But we've come for a man whose death changed boxing and inspired one of the most famous protest songs of the 1960s. Davy Moore won the World Featherweight Championship in 1959 and defended it 5 times over the next 4 years. He was a skilled and courageous fighter from Lexington, Kentucky, who had relocated to Springfield. On March 21, 1963, Moore fought Sugar Ramos at Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles. During the fight, Moore took repeated blows to the head. He was knocked down in the 10th round, striking the back of his head on the bottom rope. Moore finished the fight but collapsed in his dressing room afterward. He died 3 days later, on March 25, 1963, at the age of 29, from brain injuries sustained in the bout. Moore's death ignited a national debate about the brutality of boxing. Pope John Paul III spoke out against the sport. The governor of California called for boxing to be banned, and Bob Dylan wrote, "Who Killed Davy Moore?" a pointed song in which he asked fighter, referee, manager, crowd, and sports writer in turn whether they bore responsibility, with each denying guilt. The song put into words what many were feeling, that the death of a young man in a boxing ring was a shared failure, not an accident. Moore rests here at Ferncliff, in the city he'd made his home. His death didn't end boxing, but it forced the sport to confront the cost of its entertainment, a reckoning that continues to this day. Our next stop takes us to the San Fernando Valley, just north of Los Angeles, to Valhalla Memorial Park in North Hollywood. Among the many Hollywood figures interred here, we find a baseball player whose arm was as feared as any in the game. Don Drysdale pitched for the Brooklyn and Los Angeles Dodgers from 1956 to 1969, forming one of the most dominant pitching duos in history alongside Sandy Koufax. At 6'5", Drysdale was an imposing figure on the mound, and he wasn't shy about using the inside pitch to keep hitters uncomfortable. He hit 154 batters in his career, a total that reflects his philosophy that the inside corner belonged to him. Drysdale's signature season came in 1968, when he threw 6 consecutive shutouts and 58 2/3 consecutive scoreless innings, breaking a record that had stood since Walter Johnson's era. He won the Cy Young Award in 1962, was a 9-time All-Star, and helped the Dodgers win 3 World Series. After his playing career, Drysdale became a beloved broadcaster for the Dodgers, his smooth baritone voice becoming as familiar to fans as the sound of Vin Scully's. Don Drysdale died of a heart attack in his Montreal hotel room on July 3, 1993, at the age of 56. He was in town to broadcast a Dodgers game and was found the following morning. The Dodgers dedicated their season to his memory. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1984, alongside Harmon Killebrew, in a ceremony at Cooperstown. He rests here at Valhalla Memorial Park, not far from the city where he spent his career. From Los Angeles, let's cross the country to Omaha, Nebraska, the heartland, and a man who pitched with an intensity that bordered on ferocity. Bob Gibson played 17 seasons for the St. Louis Cardinals, from 1959 to 1975, and during his peak years he was as dominant as any pitcher who has ever lived. In 1968, Gibson posted a 1.12 earned run average, the lowest in the live ball era, and a number so absurd that Major League Baseball lowered the pitching mound the following year to give hitters a fighting chance. He won 2 Cy Young Awards, 2 World Series Most Valuable Player Awards, and struck out 17 batters in Game 1 of the 1968 World Series. Still a record. Gibson was a fierce competitor who glared at hitters, threw inside without hesitation, and famously refused to fraternize with opponents. He once said he wouldn't even talk to his own teammates on days he pitched because he didn't want to dilute his anger. His teammate Tim McCarver joked that Gibson would knock down his own grandmother if she crowded the plate. Curt Flood, another Cardinal, put it simply, "Bob Gibson is the luckiest pitcher I ever saw. He always pitches when the other team doesn't score any runs." Before baseball, Gibson was a standout basketball player who briefly played for the Harlem Globetrotters. He was born in Omaha, Nebraska, and returned to the city after his career. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1981. In his later years, Gibson battled pancreatic cancer with characteristic toughness. He died on October 2, 2020, at the age of 84. He was buried in Omaha, the city that raised him and that he never really left. His intensity on the mound was legendary, but those who knew him off it spoke of a warm, funny, deeply principled man who simply refused to be anything less than his best. Let's make one more stop before our final destination. We're heading to the New York suburbs to Manhasset, on Long Island's North Shore, where Jim Brown was laid to rest in 2023. Jim Brown played just 9 seasons for the Cleveland Browns, from 1957 to 1965, and then walked away from football at the age of 29, in the prime of his career. In those 9 seasons, he led the league in rushing 8 times, was named Most Valuable Player 3 times, and retired as the NFL's all-time leading rusher with 12,312 yards, a record that stood for nearly 2 decades. He averaged over 100 yards per game for his entire career. Many football historians consider him the greatest player who ever lived. Brown was a remarkable all-around athlete. At Syracuse University, he lettered in football, lacrosse, basketball, and track. He was an All-American in both football and lacrosse, and some lacrosse historians say he was even better at that sport than he was at football. After retiring from the Browns, he pursued acting, appearing in films like The Dirty Dozen and Ice Station Zebra. He also became a prominent activist, working to reduce gang violence in Los Angeles and advocating for Black economic empowerment. Brown was not without controversy. His personal life was marked by several allegations of violence against women, and his relationships with the NFL and the Browns were often strained. But on the field, his dominance was absolute, a combination of size, speed, and power that the game had never seen before and has rarely seen since. Jim Brown died on May 18, 2023, at the age of 87, at his home in Los Angeles. He was buried at Manhasset Cemetery on Long Island, where he'd once lived. And so our journey comes to its end, but we've saved the final stop for a man whose life was as big as his name. Let's return to Louisville, Kentucky, to Cave Hill Cemetery, a stunning 300-acre Victorian arboretum that has served as a burial ground since 1848. Among its winding lanes and ancient hardwoods in Section U rests the greatest. Muhammad Ali was born Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. in Louisville on January 17, 1942. He started boxing at 12, after his bicycle was stolen, and a police officer who doubled as a boxing coach told the furious young Cassius he'd better learn to fight before picking a fight. He learned fast. By 18, he'd won the gold medal at the 1960 Rome Olympics in the light heavyweight division. By 22, he'd stunned the world by defeating the fearsome Sonny Liston, whom we visited in Las Vegas, to become the heavyweight champion. Then, he changed his name, joined the Nation of Islam, and refused induction into the United States Army during the Vietnam War, declaring, "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong." He was stripped of his title, banned from boxing for 3 years, convicted of draft evasion, a conviction later unanimously overturned by the Supreme Court, and vilified by much of white America. He sacrificed the prime years of his career for his principles, and history has judged him to be on the right side. When Ali returned to the ring, he fought some of the most memorable bouts in history. The trilogy with Joe Frazier, whom we visited in Philadelphia, and the Rumble in the Jungle against George Foreman in Kinshasa, Zaire, where he reclaimed the title in 1974 with the famous rope-a-dope strategy. Ali's charisma, his poetry, his defiance, and his skill made him the most famous athlete on the planet, and arguably the most famous person in the world. In 1984, Ali was diagnosed with Parkinson's syndrome, likely the result of the thousands of punches he absorbed over his career. The disease gradually robbed him of his speech and his mobility, but never his dignity. His appearance at the 1996 Atlanta Olympics, lighting the torch with trembling hands, was one of the most powerful moments in television history. In 2005, President George W. Bush awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Muhammad Ali died on June 3, 2016, at the age of 74 in a hospital in Scottsdale, Arizona. His funeral in Louisville was a global event. The procession wound through the streets of the city where he'd grown up, past the house where he was born, past the gym where he first put on boxing gloves. Tens of thousands lined the route, throwing flowers onto his hearse. He was buried on his side, facing east, in accordance with his Islamic faith. Every member of the grounds crew at Cave Hill had a hand in digging his grave, so they could all say they'd helped lay the greatest to rest. His grave is marked simply, in keeping with his wish to remain humble. And yet there is nothing humble about the life he lived, a life that began with a stolen bicycle in Louisville and ended with the whole world mourning. Ali once said, "Service to others is the rent you pay for your room in heaven." If that's true, his room must have one heck of a view. And that, friends, is our tour. 60 athletes from every corner of this country and every corner of the sporting world. Men and women who ran faster, hit harder, threw farther, and dreamed bigger than the rest of us. Their graves are scattered across the American landscape, from grand cemeteries to country churchyards, from hilltops with ocean views to wheat fields in the heartland. But wherever they rest, they've left something behind. Not just records and trophies, but stories that remind us what the human body and the human spirit are capable of. Thanks for walking with us. Until next time.